My name is Robert Allen Hershey. I am a professor emeritus at the University of Arizona Rogers College of Law. And I'm broadcasting to you today from the ancestral and traditional lands of the Tonoatam and the Yaqui peoples in Arizona and Mexico. And I'm thankful that we have with us today Chip Colwell, Ramon Riley, Stewart, Koyiyumptewa, and Dr. Richard Luarkie. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. The reason that you've seen me before, or at least some of you have seen me before, is because I've kind of been a fly in the ointment trying to insist that Native nations and tribes craft their own laws with regard to repatriation. And so I thought it would be best to ask the question of whether NAGPRA itself is driving uh, the abundance of repatriation efforts, or have the tribes and nations themselves been at the forefront of this through their own laws, trying to drive the process and create actually the process. I know that NAGPRA has a process to determine cultural affiliation and for repatriation, but I'm going to be asking the question all along as to whether or not the tribes can accelerate this process by enacting their own laws. And so our first speaker today is Chip Colwell. He's I should say, Dr. Chip Colwell. He was formerly the curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and now is an editor at sapiens.org. And I don't know if you could see this, but I highly recommend, and I'm hoping this book comes through, Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits by Dr. Colwell. And it's a remarkable book, and I think it's probably required reading for just about everybody in this. And I'm not getting a commission from hawking this book. But so, Chip, would you mind, or would you please introduce yourself a little more fully, and then we can go on from there. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all and to be on this esteemed panel. I am here in Denver, Colorado, which is the historic home of 48 tribes across the Rocky Mountains, Great Plains, and American Southwest. And I look forward to being on the panel and have the chance to speak and also to learn. So thank you.
Ramon, would you like to introduce yourself, please? You'll need to turn your mic on, Ramon. You're muted, Ramon.
Okay,
there you go. There you go.
Okay.
Nice to see you, Ramon. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you guys. My name is Ramon Riley. I first of all, good morning. I had a hard time getting into this air meet first time for me, and thanks to my grandson who was able to help me. So I come from the eastern part of Arizona, Ramon Apache tribe. There are 5 tribes that are Apaches that are here in this locale, and it's good to be here.
Thank you, Ramon. Appreciate it. Good morning, Stewart, and welcome. It's good to see you again.
Good morning, everybody.
You're I can't hear you yet.
My name is Stewart Koyiyumptewa.
Stewart, I can't not hear you. Can you check your mute button?
Hello?
I can hear Stewart. Robert.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Again, my name is Stewart Bruce Koyiyumptewa. I am the program manager for the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, and I am also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Hopi tribe. And I have been working with the Hopi tribe for over 22 years now. It's the only position I've held. I've held a number of working titles for the department, but now I am the program manager. Thank you. Wakwa.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you again. Dr. Richard Luarkie from New Mexico. Welcome, Rich. It's really good to see you.
Good morning, Professor Hershey. Good morning, everyone. It's thank you for allowing me to participate with you today. My name is Rich Luarkie. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Pueblo. I'm just a member of the Pueblo, but have had the opportunity over the years to work with Professor Hershey in this space, as well as in other areas that are very critical to our tribes, such as membership and blood quantum. I've had the opportunity to serve on the National Museum of the American Indian Smithsonian, and actually participated as part of the repatriation committee. So I've had the honor of working in those spaces, and I also had the honor to serve my Pueblo as the governor at one point, and during that term dealt with the reclaiming and of sacred items that were part of auctions, and so as well as other repatriation. So I look forward to hearing the discussion today and contributing where I can. And lastly, tomorrow's Veterans Day, and before I forget, I want to wish all the veterans a happy Veterans Day, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate it. One of my goals in asking these fine people to support the Association on American Indian Affairs in this conversation is to also encourage you in the chat or in the question and answering to share your own stories from your own communities if you feel that it is appropriate and if it feels like something that you want to share. So I'm hoping that we'll be very inclusive and that all of you will get a chance to participate in this important discussion. And with this in mind, I would ask Chip Colwell, Dr. Colwell, if he would begin our session. Thank you.
Great, thank you again. So I was asked to give a very brief overview of how it is so many ancestors and so many of their belongings and sacred objects and communally owned objects have ended up in museums. And as many of you likely know, this is a long and tangled story. It's very difficult to summarize in a few bullet points, but I hope to at least give a bit of a framework to some of the discussions around the collecting history of Native America over almost 500 years. So I think it might be helpful if we think about this history, because it's such a big and complex history, perhaps in three phases. The first phase we might call an exploratory phase of looting, where when Europeans were first coming to the Americas, they were seeking to take possession of lands and everything within it, and they often didn't think twice about collecting ancestors or their belongings. We see this very early on in 1620 when the Pilgrims landed on the east coast of the United States. They were, within several weeks, they were starving. And so they started to look around to see what food they could steal. They came across a village where no one was there, and they started digging. And instead of finding food, they found a crypt, a burial area. And they ended up taking the belongings that were placed within that grave. So from the very, very beginning of the colonial settlement of the Americas, we see this kind of unabashed looting of Native American peoples. And this continues on and off for several centuries. By the 1780s, we see President Thomas Jefferson, or who would become president, digging into burial mounds in Virginia, where he's trying to kind of quasi-scientifically prove that the Americas are equal to Europe in terms of the fertility of the land and its history and so on. And as there's westward expansion from the East Coast, we see all kinds of settlers, from diaries and other kinds of documents, where there's this kind of looting, just in a sense to try to understand in European terms who the people were, and as well as much as to take kind of possession of those resources. We could then look towards a shift in the mid 1800s, early 1800s, that we could call race-based looting. So in the 1830s and 1820s, you begin to see this emergence of pseudo-scientific ideas of race being affirmed through things like studying skulls, as if you can determine race and character from skulls. And so there's widespread looting by kind of aspiring scientists who want their collections to be able to make certain kinds of claims about human history. By the 1860s, looting of Native American graves and ancestral remains and their belongings becomes U.S. federal policy when there's orders to U.S. Army personnel in Indian country to remove as many human remains as possible and to send them to the Army Medical Museum. And this comes right on the heels with the emergence of natural history museums. And just as natural history museums are aspiring to collect, fossils and botanical remains, animals, Native Americans are seen as part of this world to control and collect and to scientifically understand again. I think from our vantage point today, this can be really shocking. These sorts of behaviors, and of course they're abhorrent. But I think it's important to remember too, as I recently heard a Maori speaker talk about how during this period, this was also at a time when slavery was legal in the United States, and land theft was made entirely legal by Western systems of power. And so stealing ancestors and their belongings probably barely registered on the period's moral scale. So I say this not to explain it at all. I'm sorry, not to excuse it, but rather to explain it, to try to understand why there wasn't more objections from people in European or Euro-American societies. Of course, at the time, there was, we know from traditions and stories within communities, and also often is documented that Native American peoples themselves did everything they could to try to prevent these thefts, and they often did prevent them. But this was happening on such a massive scale that and Native peoples were often just didn't have the kind of legal power and other kind of power necessary to prevent this widespread looting. By the late 1800s, I think we could identify a third phase that we could call science-based looting. And this is in the 1890s when this period emerges, when you kind of have the full flowering of the scientific fields. And you have US federal policy that begins to designate Native American heritage as archaeological resources. So this is the beginning of national parks and monuments. And on the one hand, you could say these laws and these efforts to protect these places preserve some lands. On the other hand, it entirely divorced Native peoples from their own heritage and empowered PhDs in museums as kind of the ultimate legal steward of Native American past. And so for a century afterwards, unknown thousands of sites, it's really beyond anything, a number anyone could put on, were studied and collected without the input or consent of Native peoples. Again, although Native peoples often very much did try to prevent these expeditions and archaeological excavations and looting and so on. And at the same time, in the 1890s, there's the emergence of something called Indian corners. So in Victorian homes at the time, people thought it was beautiful or interesting to place Native American crafts in a corner of their room. And we can think of this as what some have called an imperial nostalgia, where colonists very bizarrely miss the very thing that they have destroyed. So just at a time when the Indian Wars are coming to a climax, Native populations are at a real low point. It's right at that moment that it becomes fashionable to take Native American objects and put them in people's homes. What this meant, though, more practically in terms of collecting, was there a creation of a vast consumer market for Native American crafts. And on the heels of that, you then see the inclusion of Native arts in art museums, including sacred and ceremonial objects. So today, these are the legacies that we're living with. We know in about 1990, there were somewhere around 200,000 ancestral remains in US museums. Today, 31 years, almost exactly 31 years later, there's about 115,000 still left. There are millions of grave goods that ended up in museums, tens of thousands of sacred objects and communally owned objects in museums, and an unknown number even outside the United States. So the work ahead to undo and address much of this work is likely generational. There's just so much work to be done. So with that, I'm happy to pass the baton to the next speaker. So thank you very much. I think you're muted there, Robert.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, thanks. Ramon, would you like to continue on, please?
Good morning again. My name is Ramon Riley, and I have been working with NAGPRA Consultant and Repatriation for the last 25 years, and representing the Apache of Arizona. To begin with, in mid-1800 on Fort Apache, soldiers and settlers as pot hunters looking for souvenirs, took many cultural and funerary artifacts from the nearby Kenishba, a place we call Kenishba, Brown House, Pueblo ruin site. During that era of constant warfare with military, times were harsh for our tribe, and the communities and the government are not providing enough rations or allowing off-reservation travel for hunting and food gathering. There's a journal article about a military leader during the early years of the fort, describes an elderly Apache couple who cried at parting with their sacred artifacts that they sold to him, and came back the next day to visit it before it was taken away. These things were happening because we needed food, we needed money. From 1930s to 1940s, a university archaeologist was allowed to excavate the historic ruins on the Fort Apache lands by agreement with his friend who ran the local government agency at the time. Local Apache leaders and people were not aware of what he began doing, removing artifacts and human remains that he stored at Arizona State Museum in Tucson. The tribes affected were the Hopi, Zunis, and White Mountain Apaches. And NEGPRA, Western Apache NEGPRA Working Group, is one of the most successful tribal repatriation groups in the country. We are a group of the repatriation representative and elders from the White Mountain Apache tribe, the Tonto Apache tribe, and the Apaches of the Yavapai Apache Nation and the San Carlos Apache tribe. We have been working on repatriation since 1992, and since 1994 have repatriated hundreds of sacred objects and cultural patrimony, and hundreds of human remains and burial objects from over 24 museums and institutions. While most museums have been very respectful and cooperative about repatriation, many have not, especially the most prominent ones, such as the Field Museum in Chicago and the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. We have presented disputes before the NEGPRA Review Committee 3 times and Smithsonian Repatriation Review Committee once, winning unanimously each time. And each time the museum ignored the recommendation of the National Review Committee. So the fight goes on, and we have been discussing lawsuits, and so far we haven't done more than that, just talked about it and discussed it. NEGPRA law has not always worked well for the tribes and is still controversial over 30 years of existence. This federal law has to accomplish its purpose. There are changes needed with input and collaborating on development and definitions and wording that comes more from the native worldview than that affirms tribal human rights. That has never occurred. When it does, there might be hope for our people. Here's a history that connects an old atrocity with the modern day failure. In 1882, 3 Western Apache scouts known as Deadshot, Dandy Jim, and Skippy were tried for mutiny in a military court at Fort Grant that made a mockery of justice. The council appointed to defend the scouts was the son of the general who ordered the trial. The trial itself was full of gross errors and evidence and argumentation. The night after Deadshot, Dandy Jim, and Skippy were hung, a medical officer at Fort Grant stole their bodies from the graveyard. He had their skeletons made into a display that he could show off to visitors. Those unjustly hanged men have descendants in our community who have supported the effort of tribal elders to recover the desecrated remains, so far without success. We have approached the appropriate museums and archives in Washington, so far to no avail. As things now stand, it is hard to see how these men will never receive a proper and respectful burial. Their memory will stay with us, but not as a reminder of pain. Knowing the true story of these brave Apache scouts provides inspiration to continue the struggle to find healing by correcting old injustices, and we build new lives of pride in our history and hope for our future. This conference schedule made me realize that the sacred objects and remains are not the only things plundered. Sacred stories gets plundered too, and need and need to be repatriated. I know misunderstanding was written up in the official record now held in Washington, which formed the basis of scholarly writing that perpetuated misunderstandings. When readers, including Apache readers, accept these misunderstandings as truth, Apaches are dispossessed when people steal things from CBQ battle. Getting the story right can aid in healing wounds of cultural trauma instead of deepening desperation and despair. It has been a painful process because it is meant revisiting the most dark and painful period of our history. We see now that Apaches and other Native communities experience a Holocaust and live with the effects of that legacy each and every day in our home and communities. Our holy things were taken from us when we were sickest, poorest, and vulnerable by museum representatives and greedy people who took advantage of our situation. It has been hard and sometimes nearly unbearable for us to relive that history, and often impossible for museums to acknowledge their role in that history. From the beginning of NAGPRA, our elders told us that getting our items back will help correct the effects of that history and bring about healing for our communities. So even talking about this is painful, and it's just it goes on. But if Mr. Hershey can help us with starting with you to help us to get a lawsuit going to get to finally get the National Museum of Natural History, the law, I guess, to correct it. So it's out there, and if anyone wants to help, we will be I'll be grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramon. I hear the pain in your voice, and I'm sure that pain resides within all of us to some extent. And I know my ancestors were chased out of Europe and murdered and slaughtered. And thank you for sharing that. Stewart, would you please continue on with the program? Thank you, Stewart.
Oui, Kokwa Ramon. I hear your pain, your sadness, because I too have dealt with the inadequacies of NAGPRA. NAGPRA needs to be fixed. And I think those of you who are listening, you're young. If there's any students still, pursuing their degree, we need help fixing NAGPRA, because NAGPRA works if everyone comes together, but it doesn't work when there's disagreements between tribes. And that's what NAGPRA does, is it puts tribes versus tribes in the process of trying to claim especially human remains. We have to maneuver, and oftentimes that dispute is resolved when human remains are culturally unidentifiable, which we shouldn't do, but because of competing claims. That's the only way to resolve these issues. They should be reinterred as being identified to certain groups, but that's what needs to be fixed for NAGPRA. At Hopi, like I stated in my introduction, I've worked for the Hopi tribe for nearly 20 plus years. Most of that has revolved around some sort of repatriation, whether it's items of cultural patrimony, sacred items, or human remains. I've been involved in all of that. And I've been asked to talk about how these items have left the boundaries of our homelands at Hopi. And as Ramon stated, a lot of these items have been taken by museum expeditions, by scholars, by researchers, at a time when the Hopi people and other tribes didn't really have a voice. They were simply taken advantage of during our vulnerable times. Sometimes they outright exploited Hopi clans and religious society members, holding a carrot, if you will, in front of them, because at that time in the 1800s through the 1930s, a lot of these families were struggling between the different ways of living in the past, where a lot of Hopi and other tribes were reliant on subsistence from the ground, hunting, farming. And with the Depression years, a lot of researchers came in with flour, sacks of food, and kind of placed that in front of families, saying, we want your items. We'll give you this bag of flour, sugar, what have you, if you can give up your items. And what are you supposed to do? You have two choices. You rather keep the items for yourself, knowing that it is for the benefit of everyone, or can you feed your family for a day or two with the amount of food that you're receiving? So I agree with Ramon. A lot of these expeditions exploited families for their own benefit. And I would like to see a lot of these institutions who hold these items apologize for the behavior of past ancestors, your ancestors, the people who took these items. There has never been that sort of apology to people who they've ruined cultures and lives and rites of passage, to the people that they harmed. So to take someone to exploit someone's eternal resting place for scientific study. And a lot of times, as Dr. Colwell mentioned, that they only took the skull. In a recent FBI NAGPRA case, that's the only thing that we reburied was the skulls, 16 of them, nothing else. So it's really quite sad. It's still traumatic to see something like this firsthand. There isn't a process for repatriation of human remains. We had to sit down with our elders, those that have long passed, who were doing human repatriations and reburial, to come up with a respectful system, respectful way of reinterning human remains back into its original place or as close as possible to where they were taken from. So I'm really grateful to those men who have sacrificed their peace of mind, their mentality, to come up away with a process to reintern human remains, because that is also taboo. Handling human remains. When you take part in a reburial, you never forget. It's stamped in your mind. And I am very fortunate that I have several people, young people, who have given up their peace of mind, their peaceful stability to perform these acts on the behalf of our people. And I see them because I work with them, and I truly know that they have good hearts. And every time we go to a reburial process, I ask them, and I make sure that they are mentally okay. I ask them, are you okay to do this? Have you had our ancestral spirits come to you during the night? Have you had these ancestors come to you? If you have, please let me know. If you are unable to handle this kind of work on behalf. And so far, they have expressed to me that they are okay, they are mentally stable, and they're willing to do the work. So these are some of the impacts that we as Native tribes have to deal with because of scientific research, because of that panic of maybe Native American tribes disappearing after the Plains Wars. That rush to gain as much information, material culture of people who the U.S. thought that they weren't going to be existing anymore. So we are still dealing with this. And the amount of money funding that is offered to tribes and institutions isn't enough. Sometimes you have to, bunk rooms to make this happen, and you can't do that during COVID days. We need food to eat. We need gas to go into a particular place to do the reburial, an overnight stay, and then to cleanse ourselves to go back to our loved ones after all of that work is done. So a lot of these things aren't spelled out in the NAGPRA law. And I wish, someone who has the energy to fix those, to work with Native tribes who have worked with these issues, to hear our concerns, what works, what doesn't work. I think only then that we will be at some sort of peace, but we're still struggling with all of the things left behind. And it takes time, and there are other people, if I pass on today, who's going to take over that responsibility for the Hopi people? Because a lot of our own people still don't realize or aren't willing to do this kind of work on behalf of our tribes. And I want to end with a positive note. NAGPRA can work as well with cultural items, items of cultural patrimony. In my village of Hotbella, we work diligently with a museum to return back a headdress. And it's during this time of year that headdress comes out at my village. And I know which one, when the women wear it and it's taking part in our ceremonies. That's really good to see. It's finally back in the community. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And there's joy in that. There's joy in seeing that a cultural item that has been left our boundaries return back home and be used again in the ceremonies, not only for the benefit of the Hopi people, but for the benefit of all people in the earth. You know, native tribes have the burden of praying for everyone, you know, because we made a covenant with the first being that was here to be able to stay here. And we made that covenant, that pact to say, yes, we'll take care of the earth. And that means all things living. So I'll end with that, and Kwakwa for this time to present to you all.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now, please?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it requires a great deal of bravery from Ramon and Stewart to speak to these issues, as I'm sure it takes a great deal of bravery for anyone to discuss the past atrocities and horrors that led to where we are today. It also takes a special member of a society to go ahead and try and organize this discussion and to be able to talk about these in a community-wide fashion. And I've asked Dr. Richard Luarkie to join us today because he's had such a great deal of experience, both as being a governor of the Pueblo of Laguna for 2 terms and also being so committed to the kind of the reemergence of, and to use his words, the reemergence of the cultural identity of the Laguna people. And he has been working for several years, going out to the different villages to try and discuss the issue of who belongs and the idea of discussions about who belongs to a community, either by blood quantum or by lineal descendancy or whatnot. But I've asked him to talk about what it takes to discuss these tragic histories and how a community can come together and be uplifted positively by revisiting this, and what a community can take going forward. So, Richard, I'd appreciate it if you took over, and you need to unmute yourself there.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate in interesting discussions that I've heard this morning from my colleagues on the panel here. And just reading some of the conversations, going on in the sidebar as well. It's good when there's people that are very committed to this kind of work, and as Stewart has said, it's a tough space. It's not the work I do as my day-to-day job, but it's work that I participate and contribute to whenever those opportunities or requests are made. I'm going to talk to you a little bit from my experiences that I had with my own Pueblo. Again, I'm not talking on behalf of the Pueblo in any official capacity, other than the experiences that I've had there, as well as working with other tribes on these issues. And as Professor Hershey has mentioned, the who belongs component, blood quantum, membership, those kind of things. But I think that who belongs expands into other areas too. So I think it's also important, as we think about these topics, is that, as I've always said, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. We're all different. in our approaches and our teachings and our beliefs. There are some commonalities, absolutely, but there are also some very deep and wide differences in how we look at whether it's repatriation or NAGPRA or those kind of things. One of the things that, as I think about NAGPRA, Antiquities Act, or all those kind of pieces of law, legislation, policies, whatever that might be in place, many times those don't go beyond international borders. Those stick here in the United States. So I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, of having to deal with the reclaiming, not even a repatriation, but the reclaiming of sacred items that we probably all saw a few years ago, the auctions that were happening in France with sacred items. And just, NAGPRA was useless to us. And so that was a situation where we just had to go and buy our items back. And I think in that regard, even the process was difficult because the items we had to go acquire back, they were seen by the auction as art and referred to as item number so and so. And that was a very difficult thing. To several of us, it brought tears to our eyes because that's those items were near and dear to us, and even in our own tribe, items that even individuals that are members of our own tribe don't even see. Yet here they are on full display, in an auction. So that took us down a very interesting path. In our community, again, our tribes, we function a little different. Our structures are different. Our teachings are different. But in our community, the tribal leadership, the secular side, the governors, the tribal council, we have no say in what happens on the traditional side, on the cultural side. That belongs to our society people, our traditional people. We have no right as a governor or a council to go tell them what they can and can't do. That's entirely theirs. It's hands off for us. And so, this was an interesting one because the items that were now on the outside had to be managed by the secular side. So, and that's a place that we don't put our traditional people or society people, we don't put them in harm's way. We don't put them out on that side of the fence. So you had this weird mix that came in, but it required us to come together and work together. And so in that regard, it caused us to have some very interesting discussions with not only our traditional leaders, but also our community as it relates to these items. And so as we presented what the issue was to the community or to our traditional leaders, they guided us in the sense that understanding what it is we're bringing home. First of all, is it ours? Because the guidance was that we need to make sure we still have the societies, we still have the authorities to manage or bring those items home. Because the caution was that we need to make sure that we don't bring something home that may hurt us. In other words, what I mean by that is, in some of our tribes, maybe our medicine people or whatever at the time did their practices, but they I guess for lack of a better word, they threw away things, that they used in that curing or whatever, because maybe there was battle or illness or whatever on it. So they threw it away so that it would not bother anyone else. But these collectors will go and find them, end up in a museum, and now it's part of a repatriation. So our elders are saying, be careful what you bring home, because you may bring something that's not meant for us. So those were the discussions, even with the human remains. We were approached at one time. I think a lot of the tribes are probably approached with the same scenario when there's maybe construction projects or things like that being done. As they're digging or widening the roads or whatever, from time to time they uncover bones or human remains. In one instance, they uncovered human remains. So they reached out to us at Laguna to say, we found these human remains. We believe they're Laguna. Do you want to have them returned home? Same process with our elders, with our traditional people. Where the discussion went for us is that in our beliefs, we also have to be respectful to the spiritual process, not just the physical process. The spiritual process of those human remains was already completed. Who are we to interrupt that process? So long story short on that piece, our guidance was to leave the remains. Maybe they can move them out of the construction area or whatever and rebury them. But to leave the remains, because it goes back to, we don't know what kind of person that was. We don't know what we'll be bringing home, good or bad. The other most important piece was that spiritual process already happened, and that's not our authority. The third piece to that is, in our tribe, in our Pueblo, we don't have a process for reburying. So the conversation of how are we going to do that? So that's where that conversation went in engaging the community. And so I use those examples because they can be very, very sensitive, but also they need to be very practical. Sometimes it gets emotional, but sometimes what do our teachings say? What do our teachings tell us about these processes? It's not NACPA that guides us. It's not the Antiquities Act. It's those teachings that the grandparents, that our traditional people guide us with. Sometimes, too often, we want to rely on NACPA, but that's not even ours. Yet we're using it to make decisions on things that are so meaningful to us. So I think that becomes really, really important. The other piece is that these sacred items, I think it's having had the benefit of sitting on the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian Board of Trustees, and in particular to the Repatriation Committee. I had the opportunity to get down in the weeds a little bit on a lot of the repatriation. One of the things that I did see there for this side is that there's a team there that does, they go above and beyond their required tasks to try to get things back to tribes. They do an incredibly good job of trying to do that for tribes. And so it was an honor to see that. The flip side of that is sometimes, you see tribes, maybe not understanding their own culture. And this could be a result of the kill the Indian, save the man era, and all those other things that influence where tribes lost language, lost culture. And it becomes for me, it becomes a sad observation because the tribe doesn't really understand what it's going after from the cultural side. And so I think it's very, very important, for tribes to have even our own internal come to Jesus conversation, because some tribes have a particular understanding, but another tribe might see it very different. We see this sometimes just within our own Pueblo tribes. Some items are very, very sacred to us. Other Pueblos see those very same items as art. So we have our own internal conflicts, and that creates challenge. So I think there needs to be, maybe some type of come to Jesus conversation or conference or something where, there's no media, there's none of that stuff. It's just, those folks coming together and having that conversation about, what is it that defines us. When you look at HUD, BIA, IHS, USDA, they all have a definition for Indian. All their definitions are different. I doubt that there was an Indian that helped them come up with that definition. I say that because we're at a place in time now where we need to come back together as a whole. In our teachings, they tell us, the Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde is part of our ancestry. They tell us at these places where we were one people. There wasn't any Laguna or Yakima or Navajo or whatever. We're just one people. How do we get back to that? We say we're all relatives. Well, almost then love each other. Almost respect each other. Almost be careful with each other. That becomes critical to this conversation. It's not a conversation about objects. It's a conversation about who belongs, how do we belong. That becomes critical. So I think that as we go forward here, the process with community is an incredibly vital role. It's an incredibly important, necessary piece of the equation. And I think it's when we look at community, we have to understand our roles in the community. What's our boundaries? As I mentioned earlier, as a secular leader, we have no authority to put our hand into the traditional people side. But we take their guidance. They're our conscience. But they're also our protection. Because while we're out there doing this kind of work, they're home praying for us, asking for guidance, protection. Not only physically, but maybe even mentally, that we're making the right decisions. As they tell us, it's not about us. It's not about me as an individual. Our work, Sai, Hanan, Hatzich, Gaimish, Gaishbish, Planetimish, Oats in here, Latanikus. All people, all land, all life in this world is the purpose of our work. That doesn't say the purpose of the work is me. It says all people, all land, all life. So that's why I said earlier, this whole idea of who belongs is much bigger than just one tribe. How we belong is much bigger. And so when it comes to sacred items and all these elements, I think it's really critical that another or maybe several conversations happen that allow us to have the come to Jesus discussion, to allow us to see our brothers and sisters again and hold each other and shake each other's hands. I believe that is going to be those elements, that will help us move forward. And lastly, I think about, we hear a lot about, in our teachings, there's always partners, right? There's always two, in our teachings, God and life, God and the mother and the father, they work together, a creator, the night and the day, they all work together. And as I think about it, we hear a lot about historical trauma and what that's done. But I also think on the positive side, if there's historical trauma, then there has to be historical healing. Our medicine, many tribes still have the medicine people. How come we're not using them? We want to focus on what's wrong versus what's right. This side's a little harder, takes more work because it means we have to be good to each other. We have to love each other. We have to respect each other. That's probably where the best medicine is. And I think that applies to this whole other conversation. How do we come together? Those are the key elements of what will engage a community, because it's not about finger pointing. It's about what's our responsibility. As our elders tell us in our community, you have no rights. We have no rights, but you have responsibility. So those are the things that, and I think the framework in which we need to bring our communities together. Our young people, let's not ignore our young people. Our females in our teaching, we get everything from the mother. The female is key to this solution, We need to, society over the years has diluted the value of it. And I will go all the way back to, at least in our part of the country with the Pueblos, the church. The church, we haven't mentioned that much, but the church has been one of the major disruptors to our traditional way of life. But it also has diluted the value of the female. That's a big part of the equation. So I think as we go forward in our conversations here, those are some key pieces that need to go back into the equation and will allow us hopefully to begin to recognize and achieve historical healing and put the emphasis there on what's right, because we have incredible people. Our Native people are incredible, beautiful, genius, intelligent. The intellect is incredible. We need to use it. So I'll end my comments there, and I guess we can go to the next phase. Thank you, Professor Hershey.
Thank you, Richard. I am so honored to count among these panelists mentors that have been with me for so many, many years, and had the great fortune and blessing to be able to work with all of you. And I cannot thank the Association on American Indian Affairs and Shannon and Colleen and the whole crew there for allowing us this opportunity to delve into such difficult issues that bring out such heartfelt emotions. And so, for about 50 years, I've been working since 1972 as an attorney for the for Navajo with Ganepa Ina Nehelgambed Ahe, the DNA Legal Services. I have been so honored to have such a career, being surrounded by all of you that have been great gifts in my life. So thank you all. Thank you all for your bravery here. You know, having these conversations within a community, and it's not up to me to insinuate myself in any community, but it's, as you were saying, Richard, it's more than just about repatriation. It's about these conversations go to a host of things. They involve language preservation. They involve what stories are you going to be teaching your children? You can correct anthropological and ethnographic and archaeological records that were taken out of context, as Ramon was saying, repatriating the stories and correcting the inaccuracies. I think it is. I think. Did you just? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I just lost some background noise there. Aboriginal title litigation. And again, with the standards of NAGPRA, this kind of this reasonable connection for cultural affinity. This is a way that I think that tribes need to be proactive and get ahead of the curve here, not just relying upon the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act and its tenets, because, as you were saying, Richard, all the tribes have different ways of looking at things and honoring and respecting their sacred belongings and ancestors. And I think it's important for each community to devise their own laws on how they're going to be consulted, and also devise their own laws in a way that is self-validating. It doesn't mean that every characteristic in a law has to be spelled out, but it's more a consultation and a processional. It's about process. And repatriation laws can take the form of the process by which a community discusses things, and it also it acknowledges that to the outside world and to these federal structures in repatriation, that this is how we shall be consulted, and this is how we make our decisions, and how we support our own decisions, and how you must support us. And by having your own tribal laws, they can fit better into the federal laws that protect, such as the Lacey Act, such as the theft of cultural property, things that maybe NAGPRA or ARPA do not cover. So there are ways to devise tribal laws by amending game and fish codes, by amending archaeological protection ordinances that can help instill the federal government with the power to enforce tribal laws and perhaps prevent the exportation of some of these sacred belongings and the reclaiming and reuniting of ancestors, if that is deemed appropriate. You know, to go from this idea of conquest and curiosity to and as what Chip was talking about, this kind of the Indian corners, this imperial nostalgia. And nowadays you have this intention to honor by collecting or by auctioning. We have an intention to honor Native American peoples. There is no right to revere Native Americans. The collectors and auction houses and museums have no right to do this. You're not, by reverence, your intention is immaterial here. It is important that what needs to be reunited, repatriated, comes either from legal means or it comes from relational means, which I know that a great deal of you out there are speaking with museums, but the time frame, the loss of years, and also the intention to honor Native Americans and to keep their sacred belongings safe as a means to preserving them in museum collections, I think we're way past the time when that can exist. So I encourage you all, and if you need to, please contact me at the University of Arizona College of Law. I'd be happy to work with your tribal historic preservation officers and your cultural affairs departments to help you craft repatriation laws that are a measure of process by which your own communities self-validate what's important. And I would like to ask the panelists themselves if you'd like to have questions of each other, and then we can open up to the audience. Well, maybe we'll just open it up to the audience first. Shannon, do you want to go ahead? Any questions come in?
Sure, we have some questions in the Q&A, and everyone please feel free to use the Q&A or raise your hand, and we can bring you up on stage with everyone. So the first question is from Dr. Veronica Passfield, and she says, should archaeology and museums be disrupted from their seats of science and national treasures and more forcefully framed as an extension of settler war and violence?
That's a wonderful question. And I would like to leave it to one of the panelists to answer that.
You're going to have to call on someone. Robert, nobody wants to.
Well, let me call on Dr. Luarkie to answer that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. You know, I think it's kind of a two-sided situation. You know, in that items that ultimately ended up in the museums probably got there in not the best way. You know, based on the discussion we just had and a lot of the history we're aware of. There have been some museums that I know have been resistant to returning items, to being able to work with tribes, those kind of things. So I think in that regard, there definitely is work that needs to be done. The flip side of that, as Stewart mentioned, the ability to repatriate some items that maybe we never knew we had, or we didn't know we lost maybe that component. But the ability to get those things back from the museum has been powerful. Yakima, I think, is another good example of that, with the shield, you know, being able to have access to assistance from groups like that. So, I think there's two sides to that, and I think for me, it's really thinking about how do we inform and educate, you know, these institutions to be partners and allies versus, you know, enemies, you know. And so I think, you know, for me, I'm also looking for ways to work better together. And so that's how I would look at it. That's how I would respond to the question.
Stewart or Ramon, do you have any comment?
I think if I understand the question correct, for Hopi, we have never been at war against any foreign or United States. So this is simply an act of looting on our part. And I'm going to use Harvard as an example. Harvard institution, you know, with their mighty lawyers and stuff, you know, refuses to comply with the NAGPRA law, when you request certain items, they send you a bunch of letters and forms, and they decide if it's in their right to have you access to these items, and even they're protective of these items for some reason or another, and they send you letters, a bunch of red tape rather than going through the formal process. So I don't know what it is about that tactic that they use. They're possessive, and because they were illegally taken from the context of a caretaker's home, religious society, carekeepers. Maybe that's what they're trying to cover up. I don't know. Rather than having, they're cordial up front. Oh yeah, you can come and visit, the items, and they're this. But once you start to ask for things, it's a whole different ball game with that institution, and I think they're setting a bad precedent when they do that. And like Dr. Luarkie said, these items have spirits. I mean, they're alive. And sometimes society members will discard of items that may not have fit or worked out in a way to help benefit the people. So they discard it. And yet, because we don't know the history, it's the year 2021. And I don't think there's any member in a community that can recollect what these items have been used for as for in the 1800s. So that knowledge of not knowing and the reason why they were discarded isn't there. So we really have to be careful of what we ask for. But and I'm only speaking for Hopi, that we believe that everything has good in it. That's why we ask for things. And we still, fortunately, have these societies that still use these items for the benefit of everyone. So to use that title of violence and what did she say, settler warfare, really doesn't apply to the Hopi community in that term or context. It's just simply exploiting and looting and rightful possession by taking something that normally shouldn't have left the village confines or the homelands of a given people. So but it can work for other, that definition for those tribes that have, had battles against the U.S. But maybe it can work, for Hopi, through legal violence, if that's even a word. Because, Harvard is on top of things, and they just don't want to play by the rules. So I don't know if that answers anybody's question.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to jump in here, just make one observation. Recently, I wrote a brief for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals regarding the value of traditional history and oral history as evidence in an Aboriginal title litigation case involving the Jemez Pueblo. And because the district court in that case, they denied a great deal of inclusion of elder testimony, claiming it was hearsay. And as part of that brief, and this goes, I think, to answer the question that was just proposed, as part of that brief, I was echoing the words of Joseph Singer, who's a law professor at Harvard, talking about we have to end this age of conquest because the dispossession of land and sacred and holy sites from Native American people is a conversation that should not be regarded as something that's ahistoric, that's in the past. And the continuation by museums and collectors holding on to these belongings and ancestors really is a continuation of conquest by other means. And the idea that we can forget about the conquest from the beginning because it's so long ago, I think that that's something that we never should forget is currently present. So when I hear my students or anyone start talking about post-colonial studies, I say there is no concept of post-colonial studies that resonates correctly within me. I think it is absolutely important that we still recognize that we're in an era of colonization, and it's dependent and incumbent upon the tribes to go ahead and craft their own laws, their own NAGPRA laws, in such a way that you have another arrow in your quiver, you have another tool in your toolbox, you have another weapon, in addition to the relation building that you're all progressing with right now. But I don't think that you need to abandon the idea of having your own tribal laws as another component to be forceful and to continue this fight for. And that's just a perspective of an attorney and law professor. And are there other?
Yeah, there's some other questions. Would you like to go on to some other questions?
Please.
All right. We have a few questions coming up. I'm going in order. This is from Teresa Owens. Would Indigenous nations be better served with a new legislative act to remedy the shortcomings of NAGPRA, or would making modifications to NAGPRA be preferred?
You know, Chip, in your book, you gave kind of a good historical account of all the tensions that arose between the Society of American Archaeology, the Anthropological associations, and even the idea of crafting NAGPRA in the beginning. Could you comment on this question, seeming that it would be, I know that there are modifications being touted now, like the STOP Act and the Respect for Cultural Patrimony Act, both in the House and the Senate. And I think Katie Kloss is going to be talking about that later on today. But Chip, how do you see the idea of recreating a whole new NAFTA? NAGPRA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, NAFTA is a bit beyond my area of expertise.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm just the acronyms are no smacking me in the head today.
Right. You know, it's a great question, and I'd be very interested to hear everyone's viewpoint. From one perspective, you could say that we have NAGPRA, it's on the books, it has returned 80,000 ancestors, almost 2 million grave goods, 15,000 sacred and communally owned objects. You know, there is some measure of success in the last 31 years. And one could envision how, with the right corrections, it could even be more impactful, more powerful. And they're absolutely minimally, there, you know, I think would have to be some corrections to really take a bigger leap forward in the work that NAGPRA is seeking to accomplish. So on the one hand, I could definitely envision how, you know, you have a law in place, it's easier, it's more straightforward to just try to fix what you have. On the other hand, I think we've heard echoes of how NAGPRA itself is encased within a colonial framework that is fundamentally flawed and problematic. And so if we really want to undo colonial approaches to museums, then we can't have a colonial law doing that. We need an entirely different approach. And so to me, that's, you know, an argument for starting from scratch. I think the main tension too might be between sort of the idealists, people who, you know, can envision, you know, what would happen in an ideal world versus the practical realities of passing laws, of amending laws. You know, NAGPRA itself took minimally 2 decades and more, in many ways a century of protest and argument from Native Americans and Native activists. So it's by no means an easy thing to pass a federal law. So I think, to me, those are the other elements to weigh. I'm doing a bit of work with a coalition to try to think about how we can learn from NAGPRA and the lessons that Native American communities have taught the country about the need for human dignity and human rights, respect of other peoples when it comes to other non-Native collections and museums. So as we know, there are African American remains in museums, Asian Americans, Latinos, and so on. And so we're building a coalition to look at what would it take to craft national legislation that would kind of parallel NAGPRA for non-Native remains and museums. And it's we're kind of right back where we were in the 1960s or 1970s, but with non-Native communities. And all of the experts are telling us, basically how hard this is going to be, that this is, many, many years of work to probably even just get kind of the first framework in place to try to do this work. So when I hear that, I would be really cautious about going too far and trying to start from scratch, just because I think there's the sort of practical realities, the political realities on the ground that could make it really hard to start totally anew. That being said, NAGPRA has very serious flaws, so I do hope minimally that we can work towards crafting a more equitable, well, even more than that, a more empowering law for Native communities that right now within the law often have very little say, very little power, as Ramon and others have talked about.
Thank you, Chip. NAGPRA has only goes back to 1990, and we're talking about a lot of ancestors and sacred belongings that are obviously predate 1990. And there are other ways too, and again, I reiterate the idea of tribal laws. For example, if you amended a game and fish code or a plant code or an archaeological resources protection act, if you included prohibitions from the taking of plant life or feathers, things could be then prosecuted under the Lacey Act as being violations of the own tribe's code, or the Migratory Birds Act, or the Golden Eagle Protection Act. So there are other ways that tribes can enact laws that can then be picked up by the federal laws and instigate more prosecutions of things, and also recovery in what we call in rem or seizure, much like the African Shield was repatriated to their community. There's also the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I would like to see tribes incorporate those protections and those statements of policy within their own tribal laws. Any other questions, Shannon, please?
Well, we are at 12:33, so we're past our time to end the session.
Everything back.